Hello, I'm Michael Scott in Oxford in the UK. Welcome from me and from Mike Collins in Maryland in the US to the penultimate event in Cultural Encounters, Books That Have Made a Difference, where we are bringing together scholars and their audiences in order to explore themes of encounter in literary works and contemporary cultural debates. Today, I'm delighted to have Dr. Lindsay Kaplan with us. She's a member of the English department in Georgetown, where she teaches Shakespeare and early modern drama. She's produced a variety of published work which focus on law, race, religious difference, gender, and adaptation. She's author of The Culture of Slander in Early Modern England, of Figuring Racism in Medieval Christianity, and she has an edition of essays on The Merchant of Venice, as well as a scholarly edition of that play. If any questions occur to you during this talk, please type them in using the Q&A button, not the chat button at the bottom of your screen. So it's the Q&A button, please. And towards the end, I and Mike Collins will ask as many of those questions as we can for our guests to answer. Please don't leave your questions to the last minute, as we'll probably then run out of time to ask them. Okay, I'm looking forward to this terrific lecture. Over to you, Lindsay.
Thank you so much, Michael, both Michaels, Michael Scott and Michael Collins, for inviting me to contribute to this Cultural Encounter series. The title of my talk today is The Massacre of the Innocents in Matthew 2, Herod and the Racial Conflation of Jews and Muslims in Medieval and Early Modern England. The Massacre of the Innocents episode from the second chapter of the Gospel of Matthew inspired numerous literary, visual, and musical adaptations across a range of continents and languages, from the medieval period to the 20th century. In limiting my discussion today to medieval and early modern English images and plays focusing on the Jewish King Herod, I still consider only a subset of these works. Shakespeare's plays alone reenact several elements of the medieval dramatizations. Herod's irrational assault on a messenger who brings bad news reappears in Cleopatra's violence against her envoy, conveying the unwelcome report of Antony's marriage to Octavia, while the soldier's slaughter of the young children before their mothers serves as a template for the murder of Macduff's wife and babes in Macbeth. Hamlet's famous instruction to the players includes a condemnation of the excesses of his stage tyrant. Quote, "I would have such a fellow whipped for or doing termagant. It out Herod's Herod." These three instances appear quite disparate, but as I will demonstrate, they share a common animating concept that also appears in Othello, the focus of my discussion today. A hybrid Jewish-Muslim figure who, under the direction of the devil, poses a threat to innocent Christians. Hamlet's linking of the Jewish King Herod with the fabricated figure of Termagant, allegedly an idolatrous object of Muslim worship, directs us to the medieval visual and verbal construction of a demonic Jewish Muslim enemy of the true faith. Macbeth's susceptibility to demonic suggestion and Cleopatra's identification with Egypt under Islamic control in the 17th century similarly reflect this antecedent. Today, I will argue that Othello offers the fullest of Shakespeare's reconsiderations of Matthew 2 as developed in medieval visual and dramatic representations. In order to make a persuasive case for my reading of Othello, I will open my talk by presenting the theoretical, scriptural, visual, and dramatic sources that anticipate and contribute to Shakespeare's portrayal. A brief consideration of my theorization of race articulated in my last monograph, Figuring Racism in Medieval Christianity, provides a framework for an analysis of medieval and early modern racialized portrayals of Herod and his soldiers. The subsequent discussion of Matthew 2 focuses on the elements of particular interest for subsequent artists and authors. An examination of medieval visual images follows that, attending to representations of Herod directing soldiers portrayed with dark and/or stereotypically African features. Despite the apparent anachronism, I demonstrate that these depict Muslims. I then turn to one of several medieval dramatic portrayals of Herod, the York Mystery Massacre of the Innocents play, in which Herod worships the prophet Muhammad as a god. Finally, I argue that two early modern English plays, Elizabeth Cary's Mariam, Fair Queen of Jewry, and Shakespeare's Othello, should be understood as adaptations of this rich tradition of Matthew portrayals in their racialized depictions of a Herod figure who murders an innocent female type of Jesus. The field of pre-modern critical race studies has increasingly demonstrated the contribution of religious discourses to the creation of racial hierarchies. Building on these findings, I recently argued for a consideration of theological discourses as constructing racialized religious identities. In particular, medieval Christian discourses imagining God punishing the Jews with perpetual enslavement for their alleged murder of Jesus effectively constituted a racial status of inherent hereditary inferiority. This concept, the Servitus Judaeorum, circulating in medieval biblical exegesis, religious images, and canon law, drew authority from figural readings that represented the Jews as perpetually punished for their deicidal crime with exile and enslavement. Strikingly, the efficacy of this rich racial matrix, to employ Noemi Ndai's term, proved useful in envisioning the racial subordination of other religious and ethnic groups, including Muslims and Africans. In the Crusade context, Christian chronicles and religious polemic authored by Adama de Chaban, Rudolphus Glaber, and Peter of Cluny, among others, increasingly accused Jews of inspiring or conspiring with Muslims to fight against Christians and Christianity. The coordination of Jews and Muslims as enemies of the faith gave rise to an infidel palimpsest that combined the worst accusations against both groups in a ramified racial identity. The brief account of Herod in Matthew 2 sets out key elements that a considerable number of artists and authors will adapt and develop. In addition to the texts of Christian scriptures, the Gospels and Acts, other textual traditions contribute to portrayals of Jewish rulers named Herod, including Flavius Josephus's The Jewish War and the Antiquities of the Jews. The historical record includes two Herods who lived before or during the time of Jesus, Herod the Great and his son Herod Antipas. The Christian tradition presents both of these men as murderous enemies to Jesus, activating the foundation rationale for racializing Jews, their enslaving punishment for the crucifixion of Jesus. Although Herod the Great died in the year 4 BCE, Matthew's account offers an alternate chronology that places Jesus' birth during this king's reign. And I'll be quoting from Matthew here. Quote, Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judah in the days of King Herod. The Magi, or quote, wise men from the east, bring a prophecy announcing Jesus' status as, quote, King of the Jews, unquote, whom they seek to worship. This effective challenge to Herod's status as a king troubles him, quote, and all Jerusalem with him, unquote, indicating that the advent of Jesus promises an alteration in the status quo. When Herod consults the Jewish priests and scribes on the birthplace of Christ, God's anointed king, they cite the Hebrew prophecy of Micah, which affirms Jesus' status as Messiah by locating his birth in Bethlehem of Judah. Herod's attempt to locate the infant Jesus are thwarted by an angelic dream that reveals the king's malign intentions to Joseph, who flees with his family to Egypt. Quote, this is the prophecy, Herod will seek the child to destroy him, unquote. On failing to find Jesus, Herod was, quote, exceeding angry and killed all the men, children that were in Bethlehem and in all the borders thereof from 2 years old and under, unquote. This slaughter of innocent male infants simultaneously fulfills a Hebrew Bible type, the Exodus episode in which Pharaoh orders the murders of the Jewish male babies, as well as serves as a Christian type, both prefigure Jews seeking the death of Jesus. The king's refusal to accept Jesus as the Messiah, the rejection of the apparent evidence of Jewish scripture, the plot to murder the infant Jesus all anticipate the charges made against the Jews for their role in the crucifixion during the time of the second Herod Antipas. I'm now going to turn to a consideration of the medieval English visual adaptations of Matthew 2. Illuminated medieval psalm collections and books of hours regularly included depictions of the life of Jesus and episodes from the Passion. The figural significance of Herod issuing the order, as well as the massacre itself, appears in its frequent inclusion in these illustrations. As Bernard Blumenkrantz demonstrates in his authoritative monograph, Le Juif médiéval au miroir de l'art chrétien, medieval Christian depictions of the Passion increasingly exclude Roman tormentors mentioned in the Gospels. Only Jews or Roman figures depicted as Jews often portrayed with grotesque features, remain as antagonists of Jesus. One of the earliest examples of this trend, the mid-12th century Winchester Psalter, not only represents Jews as vicious enemies of Jesus, but includes Muslim tormentors as well. This upper register of this image portrays Jesus' betrayal by a crowd of Jews brandishing weapons and depicted with gross bestial features. And you see some of the Jews have kind of fangs for teeth. The lower register portrays two tormentors mocking and scourging Jesus before a Jewish king with bestial features. The ruler conflates Pilate and Herod Antipas as Jesus was mocked before Herod and whipped before Pilate, according to Luke 23. The Jewish attacker on the right resembles the hostile portrayals above. The image of the attacker on the left, in addition to reflecting the distorted features of the Jews, differs in representing him with tight curly hair and dark skin. While these features replicate stereotypical portrayals of Africans in the period, the addition of this white knotted headband or tortil, the iconographic feature of Islamic identity, indicates this attacker is a Muslim. Given the linguistic and geographical associations of Islam with Blackness in Africa, the use of these conventions is unsurprising. The Muslim torturer's proximity to the Jewish ruler gives the impression that their bodies are fused. You can't really tell where one begins and one ends. They both have red stockings on. It almost looks like this tormentor has the same leg as Herod here. A small brown demon sits to the left of the ruler's head, indicating the devil's incitement in the torture and subsequent murder of Jesus. This same manuscript includes a depiction of Matthew 2, representing Herod seated on the left with mildly distorted features and the red hair commonly employed in images of Jewish figural enemies to Jesus. The caption on the right-hand side on the arch reads, Ici fait Hérode hausir les innocents. Here, Herod causes the innocents to be killed. Below the arch, we see the king's Jewish soldiers and a Muslim attacker carrying out this order. The latter is depicted similarly to the tormentor in the previous image, with dark hair and dark skin and curly hair, and is robed in green, a color associated with Islam. Echoing the figure of Herod in his similar large size and central placement in the right-hand half of the image, the Muslim tormentor not only stabs his young victim, but also bites him, demonstrating a cannibalistic barbarity. The visual adaptation of Matthew's portrayal of Herod reimagines the scriptural account through a synthesis of Jewish and Muslim identities in which they appear as racialized enemies to Jesus and, in effect, all Christians. I'm sorry, this image is not as good. This coordination regularly appears in subsequent illuminations of medieval English psalters, indicating a growing iconographic and a theological consensus. The early 13th century Huntingfield Psalter seems to offer a Jewish-Muslim palimpsest in its portrayal of Herod and his retainers with dark skin associated with Muslims. Seated on the right in the upper register of this illumination, Herod is depicted with dark gray skin, while a bestial demon sits on his shoulder and incites his cruel instruction. The king gestures towards a central killer, also depicted with gray-brown skin and holding a large dark sword. A decapitated child lies at his feet. This central figure gestures in turn to the leftmost figure, also with gray-brown skin and garbed as a soldier in mail. Like the Muslim figure in the Winchester image, he both stabs a young child and appears to bite him. The use of the gray-brown palette to represent all three figures and the possible echo of the Winchester depictions suggest a fused, racialized Muslim-Jewish identity. In a variation on this theme, a later 13th century English Psalter illumination returns to a more distinct, while still coordinated, Muslim and Jewish identity in its image of the Massacre. Herod, seated on the right with a large blue-grayed sword, is given mildly distorted features. Both his hair and his face are portrayed with brown tones, and they align him with the two brown-skinned soldiers in the center here in the back and on the left, who are in the process of stabbing white-skinned blonde children. The soldiers participating in the massacre at the center and the right of the image are portrayed with white skin and distorted features. A drop of blood appears on the lower lip of the central soldier. I'm going to come back to this image later, but we want to look at this woman here for a second. We'll come back to that. The Krivoklat Psalter, also created near the end of the 13th century, includes several depictions of Matthew 2. In the top register, the three magi, depicted as kings with white skin, follow the star that will lead them to Jesus. In the bottom register, they address their question from Matthew, where is he that is born king of the Jews, to Herod directly, illustrating Matthew 2:2. Seated on his throne in an awkwardly contorted position, Herod's skin and hair are given grayish-brown hues that characterize Islamic complexions in previous images. In contrast to the symmetrical, placid features of the three magi, the Jewish king's face appears contorted in a grotesque grimace. In the Mirthly Hours, another later 13th century manuscript, the illumination of Herod ordering the massacre represents both the king and soldiers with dark brown skin. In a now familiar convention, a dark brown demon whispers into Herod's ear as he gives orders to his knights, demonstrating the devilish chain of command. The Jewish iconographic context, in conjunction with dark skin associated with the African Muslim complexion, produces an image of demonic Muslim Jewish enmity to Christ and Christianity. And then this last image from the Tamath Hours, mid-14th century manuscript, focuses on pale gray-skinned soldiers murdering the innocent infants. Surprisingly, one of the mothers in a red robe has seized a lance and uses it to attack a supine soldier. I'm going to come back to that idea in a minute. But this element, not included in Matthew, nevertheless appears in medieval dramatic portrayals, suggesting a possible influence of visual images on the representation of events in the play. So I'm now going to turn to the medieval dramatic tradition, although I'm going to keep the images up for a little while longer, since I'm going to show some connection here. A number of medieval dramatic representations of Jews, including the Croxton play of the Sacrament, portray them as worshiping Muhammad as if he were an idolatrous deity. Notably for our discussion, the Massacre of the Innocents play in the late 14th century York Mystery Cycle includes 5 derogatory references to Muhammad as a deity. All are spoken by Jews, including 3 references by Herod. I suggest that the convention of including Muslim figures and images depicting the massacre, an aspect obviously absent in the text of Matthew 2, demonstrates the influence of manuscript illuminations on the dramatic text. To support this point, I digress to return to the depictions of the mothers in the York Massacre. Another aspect of the play missing from the biblical text. After the description of the murder of children, Matthew notes that this event fulfills the prophecy of Jeremiah. Quote, "A voice in Ramah was heard, lamentation and great mourning, Rachel bewailing her children and would not be comforted because they are not," unquote. That's Matthew 2:18, quoting Jeremiah. The verse replaces any account of the actual mothers of the murder victims bewailing their own children. However, of the images of the massacre that I considered earlier, most include depictions of mothers mourning mourning the murder of their children taking place before their eyes. The innovation of mothers attempting to defend their children appears here in the Tamath Hours, as well as in other late 13th century manuscripts. The Tamath Hours visualizes this threat in portraying one mother who subdues a supine soldier using his own lance to stab him in the chest. The Oscott Psalter, which is a mid to late 13th century manuscript, includes a mother seated on the ground while raising a short broadsword to attack the soldiers. And I just recognized today, as I was looking over my images before the talk, I never looked at this before, but in this image as well, the mother, even though she seems very passive, she's holding a bright red sword here. So I wonder if there's some kind of connection or influence by these two and through these two manuscripts. And then finally, the Huth Psalter, which is a later 13th century psalter, presents a mother on the far right side who uses her bare hands to attack an armed soldier. This maternal defense also appears in the York portrayal. In response to the soldiers' attacks on their sons, the play's two mothers seek to protect their children. One proclaims, quote, "To die I have no dread, I do thee well to wit, to save my son so dear." She alerts the attackers that since she does not fear death, she will take any means to protect her child, potentially including violence. The soldier's response indicates she poses a physical threat to the armed men. Quote, "As arms, for now is need, but if we do yon deed, these queens will quell us here. To arm, for now it's necessary, unless we act, these unruly women will destroy us." A soldier calling his comrades to arms to respond to the threat of unarmed women indicates the efficacy of the mother's counterattack. The fear that these intransigent, because not docile, mothers will actually kill the armed men reflects the weakness not only of the troops, but of Herod's rule as a whole. And by the way, the soldiers run away at the end of this episode, and the women are left alive. The likelihood that the illumination of mothers fighting soldiers influenced the play text derives from chronology, since the images predate the estimated composition date of plays, probably mid-14th century. The Muslim-Jewish coordination portrayed in the visual images emerges at the outset of the Massacre of the Innocents play. In his opening speech, Herod demands obeisance from all his subjects. He threatens to kill anyone who refuses to worship him, swearing by, I'm not going to say the name that they ascribed to Muhammad because it's quite derogatory, so I'm just going to replace it with Muhammad, swearing, quote, "by Almighty Muhammad." The author debases Islam and Judaism here by representing a Jewish king idolatrously worshiping a prophet as a deity and using an insulting corruption of the prophet's name that incorporates the word hound. A range of medieval polemical discourses against both Muslims and Jews employ bestialization as a racializing trope, a strategy echoed in the visual images, such as the Winchester Psalter, that uses animal features in infidel depictions. The blasphemous representation goes further, with Herod asserting that he actually participates in the power of the deity. Muhammad and me hath this world in weld to maintain us Amel. Muhammad and I have this world in our keeping to maintain between us. At the play's conclusion, having discovered that Jesus has escaped the massacre, Herod calls on every ilkaman that holds of Muhammad, every person who embraces Muhammad, to take up arms in the fight against Jesus. This conflation of Jews and Muslims enables a ramified representation of infidel enmity to Christ and Christianity that justifies their racial subordination. Now I'm turning to the early modern sources for my talk today. The Muslim-Jewish nexus constructed in medieval visual images and plays continues to circulate in early modern English drama. The fact that many early modern plays portraying one or more Jewish characters also include a Muslim one as well, The Jew of Malta, The Merchant of Venice, Three Ladies of London, Salamis, a Christian turned Turk, offers strong evidence supporting this claim, even though the reverse is not true. There are plenty of plays with only Muslim characters that don't include Jews. However, Cary's Mariam also follows this general rule in spite of the fact that the events of the play predate both Christianity and Islam. The inclusion of Saleas, the Arabian prince, beloved of Salome, functions, I would argue, as a proto-Muslim. A somewhat weak and innocuous character, he submits entirely to the control of Herod's demonic sister. As he himself acknowledges, "Thou shalt, fair Salome, command as much as if the royal ornament were thine. The weakness of Arabia's king is such, the kingdom is not so much is not his so much as mine. My mouth is our Obadas's oracle, who thinks not aught but what Saleus will, and thou, rare creature, Asia's miracle shall be to me as it." Obadas, the weak Arabian king, follows the direction of his counselor Saleus, who in turn submits himself to the divine imperative of Salome's will. The specters of Jews corrupting Muslim dates back to the 11th century, and in Peter of Cluny's 12th century summary of the complete heresy of the Saracens, he asserts, lest he become a true Christian, the Jews whispered to Muhammad, shrewdly providing the man not the truth of scriptures, but their fables. The diachronic and synchronic scope of this Muslim-Jewish phenomenon that organizes medieval racialized portrayals of Herod's massacre of the innocents persists in in Shakespeare's Othello and Cary's Tragedy of Mariam. I will argue that Cary's play functions as an adaptation both of Matthew 2, in which Herod the Great orders the murder of his wife, the innocent proto-Christian martyr Mariam, and of Shakespeare's work. In echoing the language, characters, and events of Othello in her dramatic portrayal of Herod, Cary's work excavates and heightens the implicit Jewish racial script that contributes to the degradation of Othello's Islamic identity. Before turning to the way in which Shakespeare and Cary enact versions of Matthew 2, I will consider how both plays center racializing discourses. While Othello and Herod are ostensibly included in the dominant religious confession of their respective communities, their acceptance in that community is effectively called into question. In Iago's view, Desdemona's influence over her husband even extends to his adherence to Christianity. Quote, and then for her to win the Moor, were it to renounce his baptism, all seals and symbols of redeemed sin, his soul is so unfettered to her love that she may make, unmake, do what she list, even as her appetite shall play the god with his weak function. The play does not determine whether Othello was baptized as a Christian at birth or converted as an adult, presumably from Islam. Since most of honest Iago's pronouncements are false, we might not take seriously his questioning of the fixedness of Othello's Christian identity or the suggestion that his alleged intellectual debility might easily turn or return him to an idolatrous worship of his wife as a god. However, the play's full title, The Tragedy of Othello, the Moor of Venice, has already troubled our understanding of his religious identity. By the medieval period, the term also connotes a Muslim. I'm going back to the idea of the Moor. So the constant references to Othello as a Moor, even a noble or valiant one, nevertheless calls up associations with Blackness and Islam. The Venetian and the senator's choice of Othello to defeat their Turkish opponents simultaneously suggests contrast and identification. Quote, valiant Othello, we must employ you against the general enemy Ottoman. Who better to defeat a Muslim enemy than a former Muslim? However, those more hostile to Othello characterize him as Black, demonic, and inherently inferior, negative qualities associated with Islam. Iago's degrading depiction of Othello as an old black ram and the devil simultaneously bestializes and demonizes him. Brabantio claims that permitting Othello's alleged theft of Desdemona would have dire results. Quote, for if such actions may have passage free, bondslaves and pagans shall our statesmen be. The term bondslaves and pagans most obviously refer to the chattel enslavement of non-Christians, but given the continuing association of Jewish and Muslim identity as an enslaved one, and the frequent conflation of pagans with Muslims, we might see the ramifying effects of the Jewish-Muslim racial coordination at work here. Not only do Othello's adversaries question his status, but his ostensible advocates do as well, as evidenced in the Duke's parting remark to Brabantio. If virtue no delighted beauty lack, your son-in-law is far more fair than black. By equating fairness, that is white beauty, with virtue, the Duke's apparent praise nevertheless concedes an ineradicable blackness in his general that logically suggests an inherent vice. Even without Desdemona's alleged capacity to affect her husband's renunciation of his faith, Othello's affiliation with the Christian community increasingly arose in the course of the play, of course, assisted by Iago, but it still takes place. The racial discourse of Cary's play similarly draws on Christian biblical exegesis to question the status of Herod and his sister as members of the true Israel. While both Mariam and her family, as well as Herod and his family, are ostensibly all Jews, the play carefully distinguishes between superior and inferior, true and false Jews. Drawing on the supersessionist logic that reads the patriarchs and matriarchs of the Hebrew Bible, along with the Jewish apostles loyal to Jesus, as the proto-Christian, quote, children of the promise, and thus inheritors of God's covenant, as described in Romans 9, Cary frames the figures for the Jewish antagonist to Jesus as racially inferior and immoral. Mariam's mother, Alexandra, who derives her lineage from the messianic line of David, disparages Herod as, quote, base Edomite, the damned Esau's heir. Must he, ere Jacob's child, inherit the crown? Must he, vile wretch, be set in David's chair? The reference to the twins Esau and Jacob draw on both the episode in Genesis and Paul's reinterpretation of it in Romans. During Rebekah's pregnancy, God informs her that
quote, two nations are in thy womb, and the one people shall be the stronger people, and the elder shall serve the younger. That's Genesis 25. The Hebrew word of the verb shall serve, ya'avod, also connotes enslavement. Paul quotes this verse in Romans 9:12 to support his claim, quote, they which are the children of the flesh, these are not the children of God, but the children of the promise are counted for seed, unquote. Here, and even more explicitly in Galatians 4, Paul equates observance of Jewish law with servitude, in contrast to the freedom afforded by faith. While he addressed two contemporary groups of Jews, subsequent patristic and medieval exegetes understood this formulation of servitude as proof of the Servitus Judaeorum, the punishment for the crucifixion that rendered Jews inherently and permanently inferior to Christians. Alexandra's language clearly draws on the racial implications of this doctrine in ascribing a subordinated base and vile status to Herod. This aligns him with Esau, the enslaved older brother supplanted by his younger sibling Jacob, the proto-Christian true inheritor of the messianic royal lineage, which includes Queen Mariam and subsequently Jesus. Sorry, I have to hold my phone with one hand and turn my pages with the other one. Sorry. Furthermore, Cary exploits the historical fact of Herod's ancestry and actions to cast him and Salome as, quote, false Jews, the elder people superseded by their younger sibling, the true Israel. From the outset of the play, Cary emphasizes Herod's status not simply as an antitype for Esau, but by virtue of the king's Idumean or Edomite heritage, one of his offspring, since both the text of Genesis explains that Edom is another name for Esau. Since the Jews and Christians both derived their lineage from Jacob, Esau was not counted among the people of Israel. This ostensibly changed when Israel conquered the kingdom of Idumea in the 2nd century BCE, and the inhabitants converted to Judaism. However, the efficacy of this conversion was suspected, and their status as true Jews was historically questioned. Alexandra again cites Herod's racial inferiority as an Idumean lifted, quote, from the dust of his subordination, playing on the etymological meanings of the name Edom, which in Hebrew connotes the color red, used to describe Esau's appearance at birth. Cary creates a demonic heredity for Herod. Was he not Esau's heir of hell? Oh yes, he doth from Edom's name derive his cruel nature, which with blood is fed. That made him me of sire and son deprive. He ever thirsts for blood, and blood is red. Herod murdered Alexandra's father and son. As an inheritor of hell, Herod is subject to the devil's influence, as we saw portrayed in the images of the Massacre, in which a demon sits on the king's shoulder. The Winchester portrayal of Herod with red hair may also allude to his Edomite antecedents. While Herod justly accuses Herod of murdering her father and brother, she also suggests that his lethal impulse is an inherent racial trait, part of his cruel nature that leads to the execution, subsequently, of the guiltless Mariam. This crime anticipates both the massacre of the innocents and the Jews' crucifixion of Jesus. Mariam iterates the racial logic of Edomite descent in her denouncement of Salome, along with her brother Herod. Quote, my birth, thy birth, baser birth so far excelled, I had to both of you, the princess been, thou party Jew and party Edomite, thou mongrel issued from rejected race. Thy ancestors against the heavens did fight, and thou, like them, will heavenly birth disgrace. Employing the same term base as her mother, Mariam styles herself as lineally superior to both her sister-in-law and her husband, citing their adulterated status as incomplete members of the true Israel. As tainted Jews, Salome and Herod figure the Jews rejected by God for denying the will of heaven by crucifying Jesus. Drawing on the language of heredity, social status, and sin, Cary translates the elements of the medieval Servitus Judaeorum into the racial discourses of early modern England. The two plays' adaptation of the murder of the innocents emerges from this rich racial matrix. Desdemona's whiteness, innocence, and associations with the divine identify her with the blameless victims of King Herod, who also function as antitypes for the crucifixion of Jesus. The patristic texts of early Christianity establish a color binary that consistently associates whiteness with God, innocence and virtue, and blackness with the devil, sin, and evil. The multiple ascriptions of fairness and whiteness to Desdemona clearly align her with this tradition. Othello's description of Desdemona's complexion as that whiter skin of hers than snow and smooth as monumental alabaster, employs a doubled simile. Even when describing the texture of her skin, he employs a white substance to reinforce the fact of her fairness. She is elsewhere termed the divine Desdemona by Cassio, and the sweetest innocent that our era did lift up I by Amelia, who affirms her blameless status through hyperbole. In describing innocence in terms of one with upraised eyes, she suggests a person engaged in prayer or looking to heaven for guidance. Amelia uses this description in her chastisement of Othello for killing his faultless paragon, aligning Desdemona with the innocent children brutally slaughtered by Herod. Cassio's description of the divinity may also suggest she functions as a Jesus figure. Cary similarly iterates Mariam's fairness and innocence to suggest not only her own martyrdom, but also her similarity to Jesus. Mariam herself avers her chastity, using her white beauty as testimony to her marital fidelity. Quote, who sees for truth that Mariam is untrue? If fair she be, she is as chaste as fair. She explicitly shuns the things of this world in favor of spiritual purity. To have all nations celebrate my birth, I would not that my spirit were impure. Let my distressed state unpitied be. My innocence is hope enough for me. This rejection of worldly recognition paradoxically aligns her with Jesus, whose birth the three kings come to celebrate in Matthew's text. The biblical Herod's encounter with him ignites his fear of Jesus as the true king of the Jews and leads to the murder of the innocents. In a moment of vacillation, Herod refers to Mariam as, quote, the fairest lamb of all the flock, again affirming her whiteness while also establishing a comparison with Jesus, described in John 1 as the Lamb of God. Shakespeare's play does not appear to make use of such explicit Christological comparisons, but a closer consideration of Othello's speeches in the last scene of the play suggests some connections. When Othello resolves he must murder Desdemona, his unfounded lack of faith in her fidelity marks him, not her, as the infidel. Quote, yet she must die, or else she'll betray more men. Put out the light, then put out the light. If I quench thee, thy flaming minister, I can thy former light restore, should I repent me. But once I put out thy light, thy cunningest piece of excelling nature, I know not where is that Promethean heat that can thy light relume. His lengthy rumination on the metaphor of light as a life asserts that Desdemona's life cannot be restored when she is dead, but in comparing her to a lamp that can be relit, he raises the counterfactual possibility of resurrection. He exposes his infidel sensibility in looking to a pagan Promethean heat that he correctly notes could not revivify Desdemona. However, the idea of Desdemona as being a light that could be relumed might align her with Jesus, the light of the world, whose followers shall have the light of life. That's from John 8, and who was resurrected after death. In fact, Desdemona's momentary return to life might also gesture to the actual resurrection of Jesus. Additionally, Othello's affirmation of Desdemona's innocence after her death aligns her chaste whiteness with an image of eschatological judgment. O ill-starred wench, pale as thy smock, when we shall meet at Compt, this look of thine will hurl my soul from heaven, and fiends will snatch at it cold, cold, my girl, even like thy chastity. Heavenly in death, Desdemona appears to take on the role of Jesus in the final judgment, consigning unbelievers like Othello to the punishments of hell. Also worthy of note is the demonic role played by both Iago and Salome in inciting Othello and Herod, respectively, to murder their wives. Joshua Trachtenberg extensively established the various association of Jews with the demonic. Most relevant for this discussion is the notion that the devil instigated the Jews' murder of Jesus. In John's account, quote, when supper was done, the devil put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, the son of Simon, to betray Jesus. Iago explicitly identifies himself with the devil throughout the play, while the play's conclusion suggests he is one. As Othello notes, I look down towards his feet, but that's a fable. If thou be'st the devil, I cannot kill thee. And then Othello stabs him, and Iago retorts, I bleed, sir, but not killed. The fact that Iago remains alive at the play's end suggests that he might be a devil who cannot die. Salome similarly remains alive and unrepentant at the play's end. Associated with blackness, inferior blood, and sexual promiscuity, Salome serves as a demonic advisor who convinces Herod to murder his innocent wife. After realizing his error, Herod rounds on his sister, "Hence from my sight, my black tormentor, hence. For hadst thou not made Herod unsecure, I had not doubted Mariam's innocence, but still had held her in my heart for pure." He identifies Salome with the visual images of brown demons who sit on Herod's shoulder and incite his murderous deeds. Her liaison with the Arabian Sylleus may fuel the play's frequent references to her black appearance. Her portrayal possibly reflects the darkness of the Muslim and Jewish torturers of Jesus as well, and as well as those of Herod and his soldiers murdering the innocent infants depicted in the English medieval psalters. A consideration of the final speeches of both Othello and Herod not only demonstrates a strong parallel between the two plays, but the extent to which Shakespeare's work draws from the tradition of a fused Muslim-Jewish identity. In this much analyzed final speech, Othello describes himself as one whose hand, like the base Indian, threw a pearl away richer than all his tribe. However, I'm going to follow a different tradition, a different manuscript tradition or publication tradition to look at the affordance of the first folio's Judean, a term that has now been established as in circulation in English printed text by the late 16th century. My preference is anticipated by Louis Theobald, whose 18th century commentary on this word suggests its reference to Herod and Cary's portrayal of him. In his edition of the play, Theobald explains that Judean is, quote, "the genuine and more eligible reading. I'm satisfied that Shakespeare is alluding to Herod, who in a fit of jealousy threw such a jewel of a wife as Mariam was, threw away such a jewel of a wife as Mariam was to him, to Herod. What can be more parallel in circumstance than the conduct of Herod and Othello? Nor was the story so little obvious, for in the year 1613, the Lady Elizabeth Cary published a tragedy called Mariam." While noting the connection between Cary's play and Shakespeare, nevertheless, Theobald overlooks the Christological implications of both plots. Othello's speech calls to mind Matthew 13's parable of a merchant seeking goodly pearls, who, when he found one pearl of great price, went and sold all he had and bought it, to portray the recognition of Jesus' status by the faithful. Othello, like the Jewish antagonists of the Gospels who allegedly seek to kill the infant Jesus or demand his crucifixion, fail to recognize his divinity. This palimpsest of Muslim-Jewish identity persists in the lines that follow, which portray a fantasy of infidel self-recognition. This is Othello's last speech, "and say besides that in Aleppo once, when a malignant and turbaned Turk beat a Venetian and traduced the state, I took by the throat the circumcised dog and smote him thus." The circumcised Othello, simultaneously Jewish and Muslim, effectively testifies to his own vicious error, acknowledges Christian truth, and inflicts his own suicidal punishment. In a strikingly strong echo of Shakespeare's play, Mariam makes clear the Jewish subtext informing Othello's final speech. Herod similarly repines, "I had but one inestimable jewel, yet one I had, no monarch had the like, yet I in sudden choler cast it down and pashed it all to pieces." Again, in contrast to the merchant of the parable who recognizes Jesus' divinity, Herod only retrospectively understands both Mariam's unparalleled status and his wanton destruction of her innocent life. This self-condemnation in both murderous husbands demonstrates their acknowledgement of their wives' fidelity and innocence. Such a realization would seem to open the way for a repentance that might facilitate the assimilation of Muslims and Jews through a recognition of their crimes into the community of the true faith. Given the apocalyptic impulses in the theology of 17th century England, this aspiration would seem to participate in its contemporary moment. However, both plays reinforce the racial implications of previous adaptations of the Massacre in precluding such an incorporation. While he does not conveniently commit suicide, Herod's final speech reflects the account of his death in Matthew 2:19. Contrary to the actions of the historical king, who ruled for an additional 25 years after he ordered the execution of Mariam, Cary's Herod yearns for the happy day, quote, "when I at once shall die and find a grave." While repentant, he, like Salome, suffers no punishment for his crime. Cary offers no path for redemption. Their fate was sealed from the outset of the play in their status as racialized Jews whose hereditary murderous impulses emerge in their own violent actions and justify their internal relegation to servile status. Thus, for both plays, the deployment of the Christological context does not advance a goal of conversion and assimilation of the infidel, but results in a self-imposed eradication that removes a racialized Jewish Muslim threat from Christian society. By attending to the theological implications of the Matthew 2 text developed in medieval visual and dramatic adaptations, we perceive the organizing racial logic of a fused Muslim-Jewish identity that persists in shaping early modern reconsiderations of Herod's massacre of the innocents. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. And such a pity it broke off halfway through. You had to get a bit of a gallop on at the end. But
Sorry.
thanks very much for a very interesting and thought-provoking talk. There's a question has come in, doesn't say who from it, says, could the mixed enemies of the Christ, both Muslims and Jews, as presented in medieval English iconography, not assert a claim that the generic term of anti-Semitism, at least when applied to the English medieval period, may actually encompass and target what it actually says, to be opposed against the Semites, be it Jews, be it Arabian Muslims?
100%. That I can almost just answer that question by saying yes. There's a longer answer to that question, but basically that's part of what I'm arguing, that initially the term anti-Semitism comes out of a linguistic tradition that looks at Semitic languages that I believe it's Ernst Renan creates in the 19th century, and that was really against a kind of notion of inferior Eastern languages that included Hebrew and Arabic. And so anti-Semitism, the term Semite does actually, it really comes from the name Shem of Noah's son Shem, who was understood to inherit the lands of the East. And there is a kind of orientalization of both Jews and Muslims under the kind of rubric of Shem and Asia that gets folded into the language of anti-Semitism. So I think we need to interrogate that term a little bit more powerfully, not just then in the medieval period, but today as well.
Thanks for that. G. Perendia takes that on still and says, couldn't one then also say that the anti-Semitism, both in its generic and modern sense, was intended to be deeply embedded in a variety of the monuments of English medieval culture, and so absorbed, unflagged, and subliminally at an earlier stage of one's education?
You know, I'm very reluctant to talk about intentions. So I don't know that I can't say yes to that. I can talk about consequences and results. And I do think that the part of what my paper is showing is the way in which those kind of, my current book project is trying to answer the question, why are there still so many plays that have Jews and Muslims together? Or why do you have plays in the medieval period in which Jews are supposedly worshiping Muhammad as a god? You know, there's clearly a connection there that continues into the early modern period. And that part of what my project is doing is trying to kind of open up and excavate that and show that continued connection.
Fascinating. I think there's a lot of work going on there, and I look forward to reading that. I just noted something that although Tanfield Cary's play isn't published till 1613, it has obviously been played before 1613 in order to get it published. And it could have been played as early as 1604. Now, if it was played as early as 1604, we've got Othello in 1604, we've also got something that you haven't mentioned, which is the Mask of Blackness, Ben Jonson, which is going to move into the Mask of Beauty, which, because they have a financial problem, is delayed for a couple of years. But the Mask of Blackness is certainly performed. And who's at the back of this? If the Tragedy of Mariam was actually in 1604, it goes back to the Anne of Denmark, who had performance going on within the court. So there's something there which might start to reflect also on certain prejudices that maybe the court was interested in, particularly around this 1604. It's very interesting, all this about blackness around 1604 itself. Don't know if you want to
Yeah,
comment.
that's fascinating. And I have kind of, I've thought about the relationship of these two plays, and I now thank you for reminding me about the Masks of Blackness and Beauty, and I'll have to go back and look at those again. But I kind of oscillate between, wondering if Cary's play, I think it's because it really quotes, I didn't look at all of them, it quotes so many passages and adapts so many passages from Othello. I cannot believe that it doesn't come after, or she hasn't seen or read or saw, heard a performance of the play. So, but I do kind of, but establishing the chronology is not clear, and maybe that Shakespeare's play somehow adapting her. And I'm a little bit arguing that anyway, because I'm saying that the Herod script is informing Shakespeare's play. So I could make the talk work either ways, although I think the evidence of Cary's play suggests that there's just too many parallels, where she clearly seems to be echoing Shakespeare's work. So but yes, 1604, that's a great suggestion to do a deeper dive into what's happening there, and particularly with Anne of Denmark, that might be driving some of this interest.
That's a very unfeministic response. Naturally, it's Cary imitating Shakespeare. I'm only teasing you. Go ahead.
Mike, have you got just take a few?
I don't see adaptation as an inferior form, Mike.
Not at all.
Adaptations are, each one is its own creative, and I think her work is fascinating. So I'm not going to, just because she copies him doesn't mean that her work is lesser than.
I think just around 1604, it's a very confused time, and Shakespeare keeps out of the mask area, but Jonson is making a huge amount of money for the Mask of Blackness, and then you can't actually get to the Mask of Beauty. That whole concept is a difficult concept for us to accept these days.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion.
Just one thing which I haven't had any time to process at all, but when I think about Othello, a part of what I always think is Othello's dependency upon Desdemona to order his world. She's the absolute, so there she's functioning as his god in a way.
Yes.
Perdition catch my soul, but I do love thee, and when I love thee not, chaos has come again. And everything seems to hinge his own sanity, if you like, or at least his own epistemological groundings seem to depend upon Desdemona. And to take that one step further and tie that into what Amelia tells her, he puts too much faith in her. He asks her to bear, in a sense, to be a god, and no human being can be a god to any other human being. Inevitably, she'll betray him, if only because she'll grow old and die.
No, that's a great point.
Yeah, but where does that investiture in Desdemona come from?
I think that's, if you're going to take the kind of Massacre script as helping us navigate the play, then I think that if she is a Christological character or figure or kind of martyr, he loses faith in her. he shows himself to, kind of be an infidel there. And so I think that there's a kind of suggestion of a reversion that Iago somewhat predicts, that there's a kind of reversion to an infidel status that he recognizes at the end, because when he kills the turban Turk, he's killing himself.
Yeah.
So I think that there's an untrue idea already in the medieval period that Islam is an idolatrous religion. And so I think this kind of association of Othello is either, or this portrayal of Othello as kind of wrongly locating kind of godly qualities in a wife, or infidelity in marriage, or infidelity as a theological concept. I think the play is playing with both of those registers.
Yeah, and Olivier is famous after 3-3. He throws away the cross and he appears wearing some unidentifiable token or object, icon of some kind. Yeah.
Yeah. And we can see some of that already in the handkerchief discussions in the play, the references to this kind of, I don't know, fetishized object in the handkerchief. So
yeah.
I'm always fascinated by it is the cause.
Yes.
It is the cause. Myself, let me not name it to you, you chase stars. It is the cause. What is the cause? That's always, we got to get back to that. But we have to draw things to a close. I'm sorry, Lindsay, that we've had to cut you short, or that technology cut you short. But thank you for such a stimulating paper, and let's hope we can keep in contact about these.
I would love to. Thanks for including me. Thanks very much.
Thank you.
To our audience, I hope you'll join us next week for the very, very final talk of the series, which is going to be on Monday, the 17th of November at 4 p.m. when someone you'll really recognize is talking to us. That's Mike Collins. We're looking forward to this Mike next week from Georgetown, DC. And we'll be discussing America's encounter with the land. So I'm looking forward very much to that final talk in the series. We have an interesting talk in our free speech at the International Crossroads coming up at 4 p.m. this Wednesday, November the 12th, when the panel will be discussing who will be the next major power. So that's this Wednesday, 12th November, 4 p.m. I want to thank Georgetown University for supporting the series, especially the Vice President Global Affairs, Tom Banchoff. Thanks to our administrators, Julia Murillo and Mary Gordon. My thanks especially to Mike Collins for his participation and his support. At Blackfriars Hall, John O'Connor, the Regent, Richard Finn, the Director of Studies, and Dominic White, the Prior. My thanks to them all. I'm Mike Scott from Blackfriars Hall, Oxford. You can follow me on LinkedIn at Professor Michael Scott and Facebook as Michael Kerr Scott. Thank you for joining us. See you soon. Goodbye.